Get my 6. Hello everybody, welcome back to Homesteading Off the Grid and whatever the hell this channel's about. Sitting up here this afternoon, having a cup of coffee, cheating old man winter. It's not quite winter yet, but it is December and it's 70 degrees today in Central Virginia and I'm loving every minute of it. So, came up here a little bit ago, been sitting here listening to something, walking around back here in the woods. Just can't see anything yet. So I want you to watch back there for me and see if you see it while I read us a story. Dipping back into the treasure trove today, Bigfoot Sasquatch Files Anthology 1. Excuse me. Available in print or Kindle on Amazon or from our Etsy store with an autograph. Links in the description box below. With the shameless self-promotion over, there's a particular story I want to read to you today because as of this recording, we have had Thanksgiving. Christmas is still a few weeks away, or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or whatever holiday each of you celebrate, or perhaps you don't at all, and that's fine. But it's a time of year where a lot of people don't do so well, here in America especially. I've celebrated Christmas around the world, and it's a happier time in most other countries than it is here. Because family, and I spend a lot of time in Asia, still is the most important thing in everyone's lives, as it was here, I think, a couple generations ago, but times have changed. This can be a very difficult time of year for people, and so the story that I'm going to read today centers around that. It's actually the story of two different women who shared their stories with me a couple of years ago, and I kind of put them together into one. It's a story called Snow Angels. And the message that I hope comes from this, it's really not in the story. So here's the message I want to preface this story with. If you suffer from mental health issues, there is help. There is free help in America, and there's really no excuse not to get the help you need. It's a tough pill to swallow, so to say, because mental illness convinces you don't have it. Sometimes we know when we suffer from maybe temporary depression or long-term depression or other issues. But, you know, you look at some other issues like BPD, borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, so many other things. It's hard to tell you have it because it tells you that you don't. So if you have folks close to you, or maybe folks that used to be close to you who avoid you now, if there's more than just a few people maybe saying kind of the same thing, take the chance to just go talk to somebody. You're not out anything. Go talk to a professional. Go talk to a priest. Go talk to a pastor, a preacher. Talk to a really close friend, somebody that you trust, but somebody that you know isn't going to tell you what you want to hear. That's not a true friend. The best friends you'll ever have, you might not actually like that most, or the most, and you might part ways with them because they tell you not what you want to hear, but what you need to hear. But there's help out there. There's help available. Okay, so this isn't a mental health commercial or advertisement, but I know it's something that seriously affects a lot of people around the world, but especially in America, where unfortunately there's still a lot of folks that view it as a sign of weakness, and they view it as if reaching out for help is a sign of weakness. It's not. It's the greatest show of strength that you could show to anybody. You might help someone around you. They might reach out as well. So with no further ado, as my beautiful bride dearly, aka Giggly Girl, would say, I'm going to start reading. This is from volume 7, last year's special Christmas edition. It's a story called Snow Angels. And before I get into it, I will wet my whistle once more with this delicious coffee. Carolyn was 40 now, and she couldn't figure out why she was so unhappy, especially on this day, the day after Thanksgiving, the day that she and her husband, Tom, and their two beautiful daughters, Ella and Jenna, were putting up and decorating the Christmas tree. Tom was taking the easy way out, as he'd begun to do in recent years. At 42 years old, Tom was feeling tired these days, and he was taking full advantage of his sales skills by sitting on the couch and watching his girls, as he referred to his wife and daughters, do all the work. I am working, he told them when they'd adamantly admonished him for his lazy ways. I'm supervising, and to prove it, every now and then, between sips of ale, he'd tell one of his daughters, or Carolyn, that the left side of the tree had far more ornaments than the right side, and to make sure to place their next few ornaments on the right side of the tree to even it out. After hanging every third ornament or so, Carolyn would stand back and take it all in. Her girls, Ella, 10 years old now, and Jenna, 8, were so adorable. She thought they'd both gotten the best genes that she and Tom had to give. They were already dominating all the other kids, including the boys, in any and all sports they played. Carolyn wasn't surprised, and it was due to those aforementioned genes. She and Tom had met while competing together on the track team back in college. And Tom, Carolyn thought, so handsome, despite his middle-aged spread. Sure, he still jogged and ate mostly healthy, but the occasional 6-pack, or 12, of beer and 4 slices of pizza at a time a couple times a month, or a week, contributed to the stereotypical dad bod so many men his age sported. But through it all, his ever-growing belly and all, Tom had always been faithful. He'd always been supportive. He had always been loving to both Carolyn and his daughters. Carolyn herself had done everything the way she was supposed to do it. She never got in trouble in school, avoiding any negative marks on her proverbial permanent record that people never figure out doesn't really exist until they hit 40. True story. Her grades and athletic achievements had gotten her into college, where she graduated cum laude, just like both of her parents before her. Yet, and like so many middle-class yuppie types with whom she fully identified, she felt as if having done everything the right way was one big recipe that led up to nothing more than a feeling of emptiness. It's like it had all been one big lie. At times she actually felt regret for never having been more daring, taken a risk, gotten arrested, even just to see if having strayed down the proverbial wrong road for a while may have added more spice to what she felt was her extremely boring, perfect life. Carolyn thought more of her past as she watched Ella and Jenna struggle over the star for the top of the tree. Tom, just like last year, would have to get up off his rump and help them with this part of the project, putting an end to his supervisorial ways. I can spell a 6-syllable word, but being a Southern and all, sometimes it's hard to pronounce it. My mind works like a Northerner's, but my mouth works like a Southerner's. Talk slow, think fast. What was coming to Carolyn's mind now was the 10 years she'd spent teaching before getting pregnant with Ella and making the decision to stop working and stay at home to be the best full-time mommy she could be. Tom was pulling down 6 digits pretty easily at his brokerage firm by then, and they'd never lived above their means, unlike many of their middle-class yuppie-type peers who were so far in debt they'd never get out. So they believed they'd be able to make it off of one income, and for the last 10 years they had. Carolyn knew she had lived the poster image of a life the way it was supposed to be lived. She had everything in life that any non-materialistic / consumeristic yuppie, rare as they are, could want. A beautiful and healthy family. A wonderful home in which to live. Her bills were paid and there was more than plenty of money left over afterward. The only debt she and Tom had was the mortgage, and it was less than half the amount it had started out to be, and Tom's financial prowess had allowed them to accumulate a sizable nest egg. So why did she feel so empty? Her mother, God rest her soul, now gone these past 3 years, had labeled it psychosis immediately after the event. As that night when Carolyn had been 10 years old, her daughter Ella's age, would always be referred to in hushed tones by Carolyn's parents and doctors. A night and an event of which to this day even her husband Tom was unaware. She would certainly never tell her daughters. This was one of those take it to the grave type things. A couple of years after the event, Carolyn's father, an actual psychiatrist, not the armchair kind, like her mother would label Carolyn's condition depression. And in order to keep all things ethical, He would send her to see his best good buddy in the business, and his best good buddy, per the orders of Carolyn's father, of course, would put her on a steady stream of meds. Carolyn never liked the meds. She couldn't stand the side effects. She'd go on and off of them back and forth over and over, but her father always figured it out, and he would make sure to witness her taking the pills, and he would ground her indefinitely until she could be trusted to self-administer. This went on for a number of years until one day Carolyn discovered running. It came first out of anger. Having been caught not taking her pills again and being 15 and hormonal and refusing to take them despite her mother and father's demands, she'd ran out of the house and, well, she just kept running. Carolyn's parents, having decided Carolyn might not be coming home after having given her what they'd felt was ample time to cool down, had jumped in the car and gone looking for her, and they discovered her 4 miles down the road from their house. She was standing at the side of the road, hands on her hips, though not bent over. She was standing tall, having already caught her breath, and she wore only a slight glisten of sweat on her face. "How did you get here so fast?" her father asked, after rolling down the window. "I ran," she said. "Want to ride home?" her father asked, the sound of amazement in his voice. Carolyn took his tone as a compliment of her achievement, and she got in the car and went home with her parents. As it was, it just so happened to be a month into the new school year. Carolyn's father made a deal with Carolyn that day on the way home in the car. He'd read study after study which proved that long-distance running was as effective in treating certain mental illnesses as was many medications. He told Carolyn that if she joined the cross-country team at her high school, and if the running seemed to work in her case, then she could quit the meds. Carolyn agreed, and after her father successfully convinced the cross-country coach to allow Carolyn to join the team, even though they'd started the season 2 weeks before, the deal was struck. Carolyn got off the meds, and she would end up being an all-state runner that year as a sophomore, having had no running experience other than the time she'd set out in an angry rage and ran 4 miles nonstop, mind you, in blue jeans and shoes that, though casual and sporty in nature, were not running shoes. Carolyn's senior year in high school, she was state cross-country champion, and she would win the 2-mile state championship as well in track and field and finish second in the mile. A la college scholarship, a la meeting her husband Tom on the college track team, and a la everything else ever since. Until a year ago, when she'd broken her ankle. Carolyn had been running a 5K fun run with her daughters, pacing them, when she'd come down off the side of a sidewalk the wrong way, shattering her ankle instantly and then falling to the ground and writhing in pain. Her running days at least for the foreseeable future, were over. About 3 months after her injury, Carolyn began slipping into what her father, and God rest his soul too, as he died a year before her mother, had referred to as depression way back when. Carolyn knew it. She knew the signs well. However, she could remember the side effects of the meds, and she refused to see a doctor, who she felt would insist she began taking them again, despite Tom's pleas to get her to make an appointment with someone. "I'm sure they've come a long way with those things," Tom had told her when he and Carolyn had talked about her blues. He could tell she was down, and he knew most of it had to do with the fact that she'd lost a very important part of her lifestyle, part of who she was, with the loss of her running, and it was only then that Carolyn had confided in him that, as a child, she'd been diagnosed with depression and that she'd been on meds. It was the first time in their more than 20 years together that Tom, a former All-American steeplechaser back in college, truly knew the reason Carolyn had become a runner in the first place. However, she certainly did not tell him about the night of the event. Oh no, that one, the event, was going with her to the grave. Even the girls were now noticing Carolyn's long naps, and though they never voiced their concern, they did have concern over Mommy's drinking. They'd never seen Mommy touch a beer, but a few months after her injury, Mommy started having a beer with Daddy. Now, on more than one occasion, they were finding themselves peeking around the corner of their room and down the hall on nights when Daddy had to carry Mommy to bed because she'd gotten drunk and passed out on the couch again. "Who's going to plug in the lights?" Carolyn asked as she helped herself to one of Tom's beers, the thought of a beer having popped into her mind. Everyone acted as if they hadn't noticed, and as if they were not concerned, but they had, and they were. "Me!" the girls yelled in unison, and just like every year in the past, they held the plug and stuck it into the outlet together. The tree lit up brightly, and just like every year in the past, it was absolutely beautiful. Carolyn and her family would no doubt have yet another wonderful Christmas. Their lives were perfect, absolute bliss, and Carolyn was miserable. Nothing could have made for a more perfect day for putting up the tree than what had happened during the last hour of the day: snow. It was the first snow of the year, and it was coming down now, an hour after dark, hard and heavy. It hadn't come as a surprise, as the weather forecast had been calling for it, but Carolyn and Tom had both warned the girls not to get their hopes up too much, because the forecast was so often wrong. However, the forecast had been right on the money this time. The couch in the living room was positioned so that when sitting on it, one could either turn their head slightly to the right and see the fireplace, or turn their head slightly to the left and look out the large picture window. There was no television in the living room of this house. Never had been, never would be. Just like ours, I'll point out. And the family of four had sat on the couch in that last hour of daylight, alternating glances between the fire in the fireplace and the snow coming down outside, and of course, their beautiful tree, which stood in the middle. The girls had cuddled up between Tom and Carolyn, going on and on about what they wanted for Christmas, now only weeks away. Their parents had teased them about having doubts that they could behave for the final weeks leading into Christmas. This, as every child knew, a requirement to get what they wanted. It had been a long, emotional, and adrenaline-filled day, and it was no surprise to Carolyn that both the girls and Tom dozed off shortly after dark. Carolyn had made her way well past the three-beer buzz well before dark, and she was now well on her way to oblivion. Sure, it would have been the perfect lead-in for passing out drunk on the couch, but with the snow still visible as it came down outside by moonlight, sleep was the furthest thing from Carolyn's mind. What filled Carolyn's mind at this time, while the most important people in her life slept beside her, was memories, vivid memories of the event from all those years ago. Carolyn had been 8 years old at the time, the same age of her younger daughter Jenna now. It was the same time of year, potentially, I love that word, to the day. Mommy and Daddy were finishing up getting ready for a holiday party. Not a Christmas party, mind you, because Mommy and Daddy's friends were politically correct long before being politically correct was cool, or even a thing for that matter. And Carolyn had been staring out the window, witnessing the year's first snowfall. "It's snowing," she yelled with the excitement only a child could muster for such weather. "It's snowing." "Uh-huh," her father had said, tying a tie around his neck. Her mother had chosen to ignore her entirely, as her mother would do most of her life. Carolyn paid no never mind. She continued staring out the window, and as she did so, she saw the headlights of a car pull into the drive. She stared down from her second-story bedroom window, through the windshield of the car in the driveway, and she saw her babysitter, Lori, leaning over the passenger seat and kissing her boyfriend, Michael. It had brought her. I'm sorry, when I read that, I thought, Lori, like the babysitter on Halloween. Michael Myers. Talk about a Freudian slip. Okay. Carolyn knew that about 15 minutes after her parents had left, Michael would drive back around and stop, and he would come in, and after Lori and Michael thought Carolyn was asleep, they would make all those weird sounds they always made down in the living room on the couch. The very sounds that kept her from being able to fall asleep for the longest of times when Lori came over to babysit. It was as if Carolyn thought, while lying in bed so many nights listening, after children go to sleep, or at least the adults thought, adults reverted back to the language of primitive grunts and groans for communication, rather than sticking with the actual words used in modern English. Except for the words, oh God, and, well, I gotta leave the rest out, sorry. Not appropriate for this platform. Okay. I'm sorry. Carolyn wondered, how is he coming when he hasn't left yet? He never went anywhere. Okay. You gotta get it if you want to read it. It's a hoot. Mommy and Daddy had given Carolyn kisses and hugs, and Daddy's had been half heartfelt. Mommy's had felt as cold as the snow blowing outside, but that hadn't been new. And then Mommy and Daddy were off, and within minutes, Michael was pulling back into the driveway. An hour after that, Carolyn was in bed, listening to the oohs and the ahs and the occasional "oh gods." And after Lori and Michael had both come back, even though Carolyn had never heard them leave, things got pretty quiet downstairs. But still, Carolyn could not sleep. She was too excited about the snow and the upcoming Christmas that it always brought with it. I'm such a smart aleck, aren't I? Man brat, I've been called. Deciding not to even try to fight sleep, Carolyn had gotten out of bed and she'd made her way back to the window to watch the snow. However, something was different this time. As she peered out the window, down to the snow-covered lawn below, she saw a figure. At first, she thought there was a man standing at the edge of her yard, just on the lawn side of the tree line that represented the beginning of the forest that stretched for miles beyond her family's property, much like this one. But as she squinted her eyes and looked closer, she realized this was no man. Men don't get that big, except for those guys that Daddy liked to watch put on those pads and helmets and throw footballs around to each other on Sundays. But even those guys looked small in comparison to the figure she now saw on her lawn. Carolyn watched in awe as the figure moved further away from the tree line and closer to her house. It was standing in the middle of the lawn when all of a sudden it flopped down on its back and it began, of all things, making snow angels. Carolyn laughed and she put her hand over her mouth, realizing how loud she'd been. She had the feeling that Lori and Michael were asleep downstairs, both now having come back from never having left, and she didn't want to wake them. She laughed again, more quietly, but somehow the figure on her lawn seemed to have heard her. It stopped its flapping motion and lifted its head. It peered up as if looking right into Carolyn's eyes like it could somehow see in the dark, and then it waved. Carolyn, with the innocence of a child, waved back, convinced she was looking at a bear or some silly circus animal that had been highly trained and then had escaped, having been a bit too highly trained. Whatever the case and whatever it was, she did not fear it. She watched it play in the snow and she giggled at its antics, and she acted scared when it formed a snowball in its giant hands, or paws, as Carolyn saw it, and threw it in her direction. But even then, she wasn't really scared, and when it waved for her to come down and join it, she had no reservations, and she did. Carolyn had sneaked downstairs, and she had sneaked right by Lori and Michael. They were both sleeping on the couch without their clothes, and Carolyn could never understand why they seemed to get so hot every time they came over, but she did her best to cover her eyes as she made her way past them and to the back door, which was actually on the side of the house. She then made her way out onto the lawn to join the silly circus animal that had obviously escaped and had ventured out to play in the snow. She'd slipped her coat and now her coat and snow boots on just before going out. She'd had them both by the door in the hopes it would indeed snow. When Carolyn reached the creature standing in her yard, she stared straight up and into its face. She'd never seen anything so tall. Anything that stood on two legs, of course. The creature was covered with hair, and it looked like no circus animal Carolyn had ever seen. But just before she might have gotten scared, for real, considering what the creature before her might be, the creature smiled and it giggled, and Carolyn did the same, and in unison, as if reading each other's minds, they fell to their backs and they began making snow angels. Carolyn and her new, strange friend played for hours. Sure, it was cold, but when Carolyn would shiver, her new, strange friend would pick her up in its arms, hairy arms, and it would warm her. It would give her hugs that were not half-hearted, or half-heartfelt, and certainly not cold. For the first time in her life, Carolyn felt loved. How could this be? Carolyn could remember thinking, even years later, and even as an adult, how could I feel so loved and accepted by something not even human that didn't know me any better than I even knew what the hell it even was? Carolyn, at one point during a college psychology 101 class, would hear the term empath, and she would instantly think back on the night of the event. But just as the professor But just as the professor said the idea of empathy could not be scientifically proven and therefore was nothing more than a myth, a psychological superstition, she'd written the idea off just as quickly as it had entered her mind. After having felt found for half a second, she once again felt lost. Cleopatra just joined me. She's trying to tell me there's something back here. But not on the night of the event. Oh, on that special snowy night, Carolyn had felt loved and accepted for the first time in her life, and she had had so much fun playing with her new friend, and it mattered not to her what sort of animal it might be. It was her new companion, and with her new companion, she made snow angels. She built a snowman. She and her new companion threw snowballs at each other and a few at Michael's car. They were doing all the things that Mommy and Daddy had never made the time to do with her, and after having done these wonderful, wonderful things for some time, and Carolyn having caught cold again, her new companion picked her up in its arms and hugged her, for real, and warmed her. And then they were hit right in the face with blaring headlights. Mommy and Daddy had just pulled into the drive, and they'd seen Carolyn and her friend. "Let my daughter go!" It was Daddy's voice. Without even turning the car off, he'd jumped out and had begun running into the yard through the snow toward Carolyn and her new friend. Carolyn's new friend put her down, kissed her lightly on the head, and as if it had never been there at all, it disappeared into the tree line, never to be seen again. Daddy had thought of calling the police on the night of the event, but after having gone back to the car to get a flashlight in order to see which way the perpetrator had fled, based upon his, or hers, or its tracks, and having seen the tracks left behind, Daddy did not call the police. Further, Daddy had instructed Carolyn and Mommy that no one was to ever speak of the event. Ever. And the event was certainly never to be spoken of in the presence of others, because there was no way the good psychiatrist would be labeled crazy. Cray, what a terrible label. Oh, why? It would cost him his business and his family their livelihood. Daddy, of course, would spend the rest of Carolyn's childhood trying to convince her that she was crazy. She had not, he would later tell her when she broached the subject, played in the snow for well more than 2 hours with something that does not exist. She, he would tell her, was so fortunate not to have been kidnapped by some psychotic lunatic child molester who had obviously been out on that dark, snowy night seeking his next victim. Carolyn, her father would go on to put the proverbial icing on the cake, had been one lucky little girl. But Carolyn had always known the truth. And never having spoken of it aloud to anyone her entire life had driven her into a very painful, lifelong depression. As now 40-year-old Carolyn reminisced about the night of the event when then 8-year-old Carolyn had had the time of her life, playing in the snow with something that was not supposed to exist, and of how innocent and wonderful it had been, the complete opposite of having to bury the lie of the event and the creature's existence for the next 32 years of her life, she was brought back to the present time and present events by way of noticing a large, dark figure standing just outside the tree line in her yard where the lawn bordered the forest. Much like this. Could it be? "I'm seeing things," Carolyn said to herself softly as she rose, ever so carefully making sure not to wake her family. She then made her way to the large picture window and stared out into the snowy darkness for a better look. "Oh my God," she said. Either her eyes were deceiving her or she was crap-faced drunk, she thought, because she was still seeing what appeared to be standing by the edge of the forest. Carolyn, as quietly and stealthily as she'd gotten off the couch and made her way to the picture window, slipped out the front door of her family's home and into the dark, snowy night. She hadn't put on her coat, and she wore only house shoes on her feet. She was wearing flannel pajama pants and an old Nike hoodie that was ragged and worn, and because of both factors, more comfortable than anything else she usually wore around the house. It was cold, but she was well into her cups. That's New English for she was New Englanderish for she was drunk. So she wasn't feeling the effects of the weather, and besides, her focus was not on the temperature, but on the figure she believed she'd seen at the edge of the woods. Just as Carolyn made her way out of the realm of light being cast onto the snow from within her house, out of the picture window, and into the shadows, the figure she believed she'd seen appeared to have ducked into the woods. Carolyn decided to follow. Carolyn made her way 50 yards or so into the woods before the effects of the weather and the temperature really hit her and, in a word, sobered her up. She realized she was cold. She realized she was out in the snow and in the woods at that, and in what she referred to her outfit as her skivvies and wearing only house slippers. She realized that the creature that she thought she'd seen could not have been real. Sure, it might have been real all those years before when she'd seen it as a little girl, but what she was experiencing now was merely what her parents might have referred to as an episode of psychosis, mostly alcohol and memory-induced. Carolyn was convinced she'd finally lost all of her marbles, and that she was now completely, indefinitely, totally, and undeniably bat-crap crazy. Carolyn stood, figuratively staring over the precipice of her insanity, at a spot in the forest where there was a wide opening in the canopy above her. The moon was full, and its light shone down brightly through the opening in the canopy above her. She looked up through the treetops, and to the moon she said, "F it. What the F is it all for anyway?" With that, she fell flat on her back. She made several snow angels, and then, for the last time, she hoped, she fell asleep. "Daddy!" It was Ella. She'd woken up to find that Mommy was gone, and she was scared. "What is it?" Tom said, waking and sitting upright, rubbing tired eyes. "Mommy's gone." "There she is," Jenna said. She'd woken up when her sister had woken their father. She hadn't even noticed her mother was gone. She'd simply run to the picture window to see if it was still snowing. Tom and Ella rose from the couch and they made their way to the window. They joined Jenna in staring out of the window, and what they saw shocked them all. Jenna had been right. There was Mommy, outside, being carried. Someone or something was carrying Mommy, limp in its arms, from out of the forest. Just as it reached where the light cast through the window met the darkness, it knelt, and it ever so gingerly laid Mommy in the snow. Then it stood, it turned, and it slowly made its way back into the forest. "What in the name of God?" Tom said, just a whisper. "Go get her, Daddy," Ella said, "before that bear comes back." Tom knew that what had carried his wife out of the forest and laid her on the snow-covered lawn was certainly no bear, but he did agree that it would be best for him to retrieve his wife and bring her into the house before it, whatever in God's name it, or he, or she, was, returned, and he did. When Tom brought Carolyn into the house, he carried her straight to their bedroom and put her in bed. She slept the rest of the night, the alcohol running through her veins, a big help. When she woke up the next morning, fortunately with no hangover, she believed she'd had a very vivid dream brought on, no doubt, by a combination of the time of year, the snow, the booze, but mostly memories of the event from all those years ago. However, Tom and the girls, after allowing Carolyn plenty of time to wake up over coffee, informed her that the events of the night before had not been a dream. They had been real. Very real. Carolyn's family decided they'd keep the events between themselves. However, unlike her parents when she'd been a child, they decided that they could and would speak of the events amongst themselves as freely and as often as they liked. Carolyn found immediate comfort in being able to talk about things no one else would ever believe with the people who mattered to her the most. She found comfort in knowing she was not crazy, and she found comfort in no longer having to live a lie. Carolyn gave up drinking as a New Year's resolution a little more than a month later. By the following spring, her injury had healed to the point that she could begin running lightly again, and by fall she was running local 5Ks and 10Ks again. And every Christmas, while families all over the world stare out their windows, waiting on a fat man in a red suit who is said to ride around the entire world, giving gifts to all the children of the world, Carolyn and her family stare out their big picture window waiting to catch a glimpse of something else. Something as reclusive, if not more so, than the man they call St. Nick. They wait, sometimes patiently, sometimes not, to see if they can capture just a glimpse of, potentially, Bigfoot Sasquatch. The end. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to go into the woods and see what I can find. See you for more next time.